The on-air sign flickered to life, its crimson glow bathing the small studio in an eerie light. I adjusted the headphones, feeling the familiar pressure on my ears as I leaned into the microphone. A sea of soundproofing foam surrounded me, muting the world outside. It was just me, my voice, and my listeners, a perfect cocoon for the secrets people spilled under the cover of darkness. "Good evening, night owls," I began, letting my voice dip into that smooth, practiced tone I'd perfected over years of broadcasting. "This is Night Pulse with your host, Adrian Cross. Tonight, we're talking about fear. What keeps you up at night? What dark thought follows you into the shadows? Call me, and let's exorcise those demons together." It was a topic I revisited often on my late-night radio show. Fear was universal, and everyone had a story to tell. The lines lit up almost instantly, but I let them blink for a moment, savoring the power of making my audience wait. I chose a line at random, clicking the button with a practiced motion. "Caller, you're on the air. What's your name, and what scares you?" There was a crackle of static, followed by a voice so faint I almost thought it was a bad connection. "My name is Eleanor." The words were soft but clear, a whisper carried through the wires. "Welcome, Eleanor. What's haunting you tonight?" "I'm afraid of the dark," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Classic fear," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "What about the dark scares you? Is it what might be hiding in it? Or something else?" Eleanor hesitated. "I don't think the dark hides anything. I think it shows things we're not supposed to see." Her answer caught me off guard, but I recovered quickly. Years of live radio taught me to think on my feet. That's an interesting perspective. Have you ever seen something in the dark that you couldn't explain? She paused again, the silence dragging out just long enough to feel uncomfortable. "I saw someone once," she said finally. "A man standing at the foot of my bed. He didn't have a face." A chill ran down my spine. That sounds terrifying. Did you ever find out who, or what, it was? "No," she whispered. I didn't want to. I was about to press her for more details when the line went dead. No click, no warning, just silence. I glanced at the screen. Her number was listed, but it didn't match any area code I recognized. A glitch, I decided, and moved on to the next caller. But Eleanor's words lingered in the back of my mind. The rest of the show was uneventful, a mix of nervous confessions and harmless thrills. But when I got home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Eleanor's voice had a strange quality, like it was coming from somewhere far away, not just physically, but emotionally, as though she were speaking across a great void. I fell asleep with the radio on, the low hum of static keeping me company. The next night, I started the show with the usual energy, though my thoughts kept circling back to Eleanor. I found myself glancing at the phone lines more than usual, waiting for a repeat of that ghostly voice. It came just after midnight. "Adrian," a male voice rasped through the receiver, thick with static. "You're on the air," I said, a twinge of unease creeping into my tone. "Who's this?" "My name is Thomas," the caller replied. His voice was hollow, like the sound of wind whistling through an empty house. "What scares you, Thomas?" "I'm afraid of forgetting," he said. "Of being forgotten." "That's a heavy fear," I replied, leaning closer to the mic. "What makes you feel that way?" "My wife doesn't remember me anymore," he said. His voice cracked, and I could hear something like tears in his words. "I died 5 years ago. She's moved on, and now I'm slipping away." The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I stared at the monitor, but once again, his number was untraceable, a string of zeros that made no sense. "You're saying you're dead, Thomas?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral. "Yes," he whispered. "And you have to help us. You're the only one who can hear us now." The line went dead before I could respond. I sat in the studio, the faint hum of equipment the only sound in the suffocating silence. The lines were still blinking, but my hand hovered over the controls, hesitating. The words of the last caller, "You're the only one who can hear us now," echoed in my head, filling the room with an invisible weight. "Adrian," my producer Janice's voice came through the headset, calm but edged with concern. "You okay in there? You're live." I blinked, snapped out of my daze, and clicked the mic back on. "Apologies, listeners," I said, forcing a chuckle. "Sometimes the late-night hour gets the best of us. Let's take another call." My finger moved on instinct, pressing a random line. "You're on the air with Night Pulse. What's your name, and what keeps you awake tonight?" The pause stretched long enough for me to think the caller had hung up, but then a faint voice crackled through. "My name is Margaret." Her voice was old and brittle, like a dry leaf crumbling underfoot. "Welcome, Margaret," I said. "What's on your mind tonight?" "I'm afraid of windows," she whispered. I frowned, caught off guard. "Windows? That's an unusual one. Can you tell me why?" Margaret exhaled shakily, the sound cutting in and out like a bad signal. "When you look out a window at night, you see your reflection. But sometimes it's not you looking back." Her words sent a prickle down my spine. "Have you experienced that, Margaret? Something unnatural?" "Yes," she said, her voice rising with a tremor of fear. "The thing in the window smiled at me. And it didn't stop smiling, even after I closed the curtains. It's still there, waiting." The line cut out before I could respond. A dull static replaced her voice, and my monitor showed the same strange series of zeros for her number. By the end of the show, I was a wreck. 3 calls. 3 voices that felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. I told myself it was a prank, maybe some tech-savvy listener messing with my equipment. But deep down, I knew better. As I packed up for the night, Janice walked into the studio, her brow furrowed. "You sure you're okay? You looked rattled tonight." "Yeah, I'm fine," I lied, avoiding her gaze. "Those last few calls were weird," she said. "Something about them didn't sit right." "You think someone's spoofing numbers?" "Maybe," I said quickly, eager to end the conversation. "I'll look into it tomorrow." She hesitated, then nodded. "Get some rest, Adrian. You look like you need it." That night, sleep didn't come easily. The voices followed me into the quiet of my apartment, their words replaying over and over. Eleanor's faceless man. Thomas's fading existence. Margaret's sinister reflection. Each story felt like a piece of a larger puzzle, but the picture was still maddeningly incomplete. Around 3 a.m., I gave up on sleep and wandered into my living room. I turned on the radio, an old habit when insomnia struck, and let the soft hiss of static fill the room. I didn't even bother tuning to a station, just let the emptiness wash over me. Then, through the static, I heard it. "Adrian." My heart jumped into my throat. I scrambled for the dial, thinking I'd accidentally landed on my own broadcast. But the voice came again, soft and ghostly. "You have to listen." The sound cut out, leaving only the hiss of static behind. The next night, I was back in the studio, pretending nothing was wrong. The routine of setting up for the show felt like slipping into an old coat, comforting and familiar. But as the on-air light flicked on, my pulse quickened. "Good evening, listeners," I began, my voice steady despite the hammering in my chest. "This is Adrian Cross, and you're listening to Night Pulse. Tonight's topic is déjà vu. You ever had a moment where you swear you've lived it before? Call me and let's talk about it." The lines lit up immediately, but I ignored them, staring at the phone panel like it was a ticking bomb. When I finally hit a button, I braced myself for the worst. "Caller, you're on the air. What's your name?" A pause, then, "Eleanor." My blood ran cold. "Eleanor? You called 2 nights ago." I know, she said softly. How did you? I don't have much time, she interrupted. Her voice had a new urgency, sharper and more insistent. You need to listen, Adrian. We're trying to warn you. Warn me about what? I demanded, my voice rising. But before she could answer, the line went dead again. This time, I didn't move on to another caller. I stared at the monitor, my hands trembling. Adrian, Janice's voice came through the headset, tight with worry. Are you okay? You've got people waiting. I'm fine, I muttered, switching off the mic. But I wasn't fine. Something was happening, something I couldn't explain. And as much as I wanted to brush it off as a technical glitch or a prank, the truth was clawing its way into my mind. The voices were real. And they were trying to tell me something. The studio felt different that night. The familiar hum of the equipment seemed louder, more intrusive, as though the machines themselves were whispering secrets I wasn't meant to hear. My producer, Janice, had stopped trying to ask if I was okay. She didn't need to, the answer was written all over my face. For the first time in years, I didn't look forward to going live. The microphone, once a comforting extension of myself, now loomed like an instrument of judgment. But I had a job to do, and people were counting on me, even if some of those people were no longer alive. The on-air lights snapped on, and I drew a deep breath, slipping into my broadcaster persona like armor. Good evening, listeners. This is Night Pulse, and I'm your host, Adrian Cross. Tonight, we're diving into the unknown. Have you ever had an experience you couldn't explain? A moment that made you question reality? Call in, and let's explore the mysteries together. I didn't expect anyone to take the bait. Part of me hoped the lines would stay dead, that I could ride out the night with harmless chatter about UFOs or strange coincidences. But the phone lines lit up like a Christmas tree, and I knew there was no escaping what was coming. I pressed the button for line 3, my finger trembling. Caller, you're on the air. What's your name, and what can't you explain? The static was immediate, louder than usual, like the sound of a storm raging on the other end. Adrian. My stomach dropped. The voice was familiar, Margaret, the woman who was afraid of windows. Margaret, I said carefully, you called the other night. I had to, she said, her voice trembling with fear. I think it's too late for me. Too late for what? I asked, leaning forward. Her reply was almost drowned out by the static. It got in. Through the window. The line went dead. I stared at the console, my heart pounding. Margaret's voice had been different this time, closer, louder, as if she were sitting right there in the studio with me. I was about to address the listeners when another line lit up. I hesitated, then answered. This is Night Pulse. You're on the air. A man's voice came through, calm but heavy with something I couldn't place. You're not safe, Adrian. Who is this? I demanded, my voice sharper than I intended. Thomas, he said, the name hitting me like a punch to the gut. Thomas, you called before, I said, gripping the edge of the desk. What's going on? What are you trying to tell me? You need to leave the studio, he said. Now. The urgency in his voice sent a shiver down my spine. Why? What's happening? There was a long pause, and then he whispered, they know you're listening. The line went dead again, but this time, the studio lights flickered. The equipment let out a low hum, the sound deep and resonant, vibrating through my chest. Adrian. Janice's voice crackled through the headset. What's going on? The board's glitching out. I don't know, I said, my throat dry. Just, stay in the booth. She didn't respond, and for a terrifying moment, I thought the connection had failed entirely. Then I heard her voice again, faint and distant. Adrian, something's wrong out here. I think. The line cut out, leaving only static. I stood, the studio suddenly feeling too small, too enclosed. The air was heavy, pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. I moved to the door and opened it, stepping into the dim hallway. "Janice?" I called, my voice echoing off the walls. The station was eerily quiet. The faint hum of fluorescent lights was gone, replaced by a deep, oppressive silence. I made my way to the producer's booth, my footsteps unnaturally loud. When I reached it, the chair was empty, the monitors displaying only static. "Janice?" I called again, panic creeping into my voice. No answer. I turned to head back to the studio when I saw it. At the end of the hallway, just beyond the edge of the light, a figure stood motionless. It was tall and indistinct, its outline shimmering like a heat mirage. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The figure didn't move. I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to run. But then the figure shifted, stepping into the light. It had no face. Back in the studio, I locked the door behind me, my chest heaving. I fumbled with the microphone, switching it back on. "Listeners," I said, my voice unsteady. I need to know if anyone else out there has seen something like this. A figure with no face. If you've had a similar experience, call me." The lines lit up immediately. I pressed the button for line 5, desperate for answers. "You're on the air. Have you seen it?" The voice that came through was faint but familiar. "It's Eleanor," she said. "Adrian, it's coming for you." My blood turned to ice. "What's coming? What does it want?" "They're not just warnings," she said, her voice breaking. "They're invitations. Every call you take brings it closer. You have to stop." Before I could respond, the lights in the studio went out. And then, in the dark, I heard it. A faint whisper, impossibly close. "Adrian." The studio plunged into darkness, the faint hum of the equipment fading to silence. My breaths came in short, sharp bursts, the kind of panicked rhythm you can't control no matter how hard you try. The whisper, "Adrian," still echoed in my ears, impossibly close, like it had been breathed into my mind rather than spoken aloud. I fumbled for my phone, its screen casting a weak glow into the oppressive black. My hands shook as I activated the flashlight, the beam slicing through the void. The studio looked the same as it always had, the desk cluttered with papers, the soundboard blinking faintly in standby mode, the on-air sign above the door now dim. But it felt wrong. Like I wasn't alone. "Janice?" I called, my voice trembling. No response. The silence was so heavy it felt alive, pressing against my ears. I forced myself to move, my flashlight trembling as I aimed it toward the door. Slowly, I unlocked it and stepped into the hallway. "Janice." I called again, louder this time. The hallway stretched before me, unervingly empty. The faint, flickering light from a single bulb at the far end cast long, distorted shadows. I edged forward, my every step amplified by the unnerving stillness. Halfway down the hall, I stopped. There was a sound. It was faint, like the soft rustling of fabric, coming from the direction of the break room. I turned my flashlight toward it, the beam shaking as it illuminated the open doorway. "Janice?" I whispered, the word barely audible. The rustling stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, from the shadows just beyond the doorway, a figure emerged. It was tall and thin, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. Its movements were slow and deliberate, as though it were savoring each step it took toward me. My flashlight landed on its face, or rather, the absence of one. The figure had no features, just a smooth expanse of pale, glistening flesh where a face should have been. I froze, every muscle in my body locked in terror. The figure stopped just at the edge of the flashlight's beam, its head tilting even further as if studying me. Adrian, it whispered, the voice rasping through the air like dry leaves dragged across stone. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. What do you want? I choked out, my voice cracking. It didn't respond. Instead, it lifted a hand, its fingers impossibly long and spindly, and pointed past me, toward the studio. I don't remember running, but I must have. One moment I was staring at the faceless figure, and the next, I was back in the studio, slamming the door shut and locking it. My chest heaved as I struggled to catch my breath. The studio lights flickered back on, casting the room in a harsh, sterile glow. Everything looked normal, but I knew better. I moved to the soundboard, hands shaking as I switched the mic back on. Listeners, I said, my voice trembling, if you're still with me, I need your help. Have you ever seen something like this? A figure with no face. If you've experienced anything similar, please call in. The phone lines lit up immediately, every line blinking in unison. I hesitated. Eleanor's words echoed in my mind, every call you take brings it closer. But I needed answers. With a deep breath, I answered line 1. You're on the air, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Have you seen it? The voice that responded was soft, almost childlike. Yes. Who is this? I asked. My name is Lily, the voice said. I saw it last week. It was outside my bedroom window. My stomach tightened. What happened? It smiled at me, she whispered, her voice trembling. And then, it came inside. Inside? I repeated, dread clawing at my chest. What do you mean? There was a long pause. Then, barely audible, I'm not Lily anymore. The line went dead. The next call came through before I could even process what I'd just heard. This is Night Pulse. You're on the air. The voice that answered was familiar. Adrian, it's Thomas. Thomas, I said, my heart pounding. Tell me what's going on. Who, or what, are these things? They're not human, he said, his voice hollow. They're drawn to fear, to pain. And your show. He trailed off. My show. I pressed. It's a beacon, he said finally. You've been calling them without realizing it. Every story, every fear you broadcast, it feeds them, brings them closer. I felt the blood drain from my face. Why me? Why this show? You're different, Thomas said. You can hear us. You can hear them. That makes you a door, Adrian. A way in. The line crackled, and I heard something else, another voice, faint but insistent, whispering my name over and over. Thomas, I said, panic rising in my chest. How do I stop this? You can't, he said, his voice fading. They're already here. The line went dead, and this time, every light in the studio flickered violently before going out. In the suffocating darkness, I heard it again. Adrian. The voice was everywhere, surrounding me, suffocating me. And then, just behind me, I felt it, cold, impossibly cold. I turned, the faint glow of my phone's flashlight catching the pale, faceless figure standing inches away. Its hand reached out, its fingers brushing my chest. And then, everything went black. I awoke to silence. The studio was gone, replaced by a suffocating darkness that stretched endlessly in every direction. My body felt weightless, like I was floating in a void, but my skin tingled with the sensation of something watching, many somethings. Adrian, a voice whispered, close to my ear but impossible to place. I twisted around, searching for the source, but there was nothing. Just the black. Where am I? I called out, my voice echoing strangely, as if the void itself were repeating my words. You're between, another voice said, this one deeper, rasping like a breath pulled through cracked glass. Between what? I demanded, panic creeping into my tone. Between their world and ours, the voice replied. A faint glow appeared in the distance, pulsing like a dying heartbeat. I moved toward it instinctively, though I wasn't walking. It was as if the darkness carried me forward, pushing me toward the light. The glow resolved into a shape, a door, tall and narrow, made of pale, warped wood. Carved into its surface were strange symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when I looked at them. "You're the door," the deep voice said again, this time closer, right behind me. I spun around and froze. They were there. Dozens of figures, their faceless heads tilted in unison, watching me without eyes. Their bodies were unnaturally still, save for the faint twitching of their fingers, long and sharp like knives. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "You brought us here," one of them said, its voice overlapping with the others, creating a horrible, layered sound that made my head throb. "You opened the way." "No," I said, shaking my head. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know." "You knew," they whispered in unison. "You listened. You called to us. And now, you will finish what you began." The door behind me groaned, the symbols glowing faintly as it began to open. A cold wind rushed out, carrying with it the sound of whispers, countless voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. "No," I said again, more forcefully this time. "I didn't ask for this. I don't want this." The figures stepped closer, their movements slow but deliberate. "You have no choice," they said. "The door must open. It is already begun." The whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a storm. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The voices were inside me, crawling through my mind, filling it with images I didn't understand. A vast, empty landscape. A city in ruins, its streets crawling with shadowy figures. A sky that bled darkness, blotting out the stars. Through the chaos, one voice cut through, clear and sharp. "Adrian." I opened my eyes and saw her. Eleanor. She stood in the void, her body faintly translucent, like a projection barely holding together. Her eyes were wide with fear, her hands outstretched toward me. "You have to stop it," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know how," I said, my own voice breaking. "You can," she insisted, stepping closer. "You're the one they need. If you don't let them through, they can't take everything." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Everything? My mind raced, piecing together fragments of what I'd heard. The calls, the warnings, the faceless figures, they weren't just here for me. They wanted to come through, to consume the world on the other side. But the door was already opening. "I can't stop it," I said, panic rising in my chest. "It's too late." Eleanor grabbed my hands, her grip surprisingly solid for someone who wasn't entirely here. "You're the door, Adrian. That means you control it. You have to close it." "How?" I demanded. She hesitated, her expression twisting with pain. "You have to sever the connection." I frowned. "What connection?" She didn't answer. Instead, she looked past me, her face pale with terror. "They're coming." I turned and saw the faceless figures, now mere feet away, their arms outstretched. "Adrian," they whispered, their voices echoing in my mind. I felt their cold presence wrap around me, pulling me toward the door. The symbols carved into the wood burned with an intense light, and the whispers from within reached a deafening crescendo. "You have to do it now," Eleanor screamed. I closed my eyes, focusing on her words. Sever the connection. The realization hit me like a thunderclap. The show. The radio. It was the tether, the beacon drawing them here. "I have to destroy the show," I said aloud, opening my eyes. Eleanor nodded, tears streaming down her face. "It's the only way." Back in the studio, I woke with a jolt, the world snapping into focus. The lights were still out, and the air was thick with an unnatural chill. The equipment hummed faintly, a low, malevolent sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I didn't waste time. I grabbed the heavy metal stool from the corner of the room and swung it with all my strength into the soundboard. Sparks flew as the equipment shattered, the hum dying with a final, stuttering groan. The on-air sign flickered violently before going dark. The studio fell silent. For a moment, I thought it had worked. The oppressive weight in the air lifted slightly, and the shadows seemed less dense. But then, from the hallway, I heard it. Adrian. The whisper was closer now, more insistent. The faceless figures weren't gone. They were angry. The whisper slithered through the air, chilling me to the core. Adrian. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Destroying the soundboard hadn't been enough. Whatever I'd done to draw them here, it was too late to undo. The studio door creaked open, and my flashlight beam flickered wildly as I pointed it toward the sound. They were there. The faceless figures poured into the room like shadows come to life, their tall, thin forms bending unnaturally as they moved. Their heads tilted in unison, all directed at me, and though they had no eyes, I felt their gaze burrowing into my soul. "You are ours," they whispered, their voices merging into an echoing symphony of dread. "No!" I shouted, grabbing the stool again and hurling it at the closest figure. It passed through the creature like smoke, clanging uselessly against the wall. The figures advanced, their long fingers twitching, reaching for me. I scrambled backward, my mind racing. "Think, Adrian. There has to be a way out of this." Eleanor's words rang in my ears, "You're the door. That means you control it." But how could I control something I didn't understand? Desperate, I turned to the shattered equipment, my flashlight catching the glint of broken dials and twisted wires. The radio was dead, but its presence still lingered, an invisible tether that bound me to the faceless things closing in. If I was the door, I realized, then I had to close myself off. I turned back to the creatures, forcing myself to face them despite the terror clawing at my chest. "If you need me to come through," I said, my voice trembling, "then I can shut you out, too." They stopped, their bodies freezing mid-step. The air grew heavier, pressing down on me as their whispers swelled into a deafening roar. "You cannot stop us," they hissed. "The door has been opened." "Maybe," I said, my heart hammering. "But it's my door." The creatures surged toward me, their movements faster now, more frantic. But I didn't retreat. I closed my eyes and focused, blocking out their whispers, their presence, everything but the faint thread of connection I could feel deep inside me, the thing they were using to get through. I imagined it snapping, breaking apart like a frayed wire. "Close it," I told myself. "Shut them out." The whispers grew louder, nearly unbearable, but I held on, clinging to the mental image of the door slamming shut. I poured every ounce of willpower I had into the thought, the effort leaving me gasping for air. And then, suddenly, the whispers stopped. I opened my eyes. The studio was empty. The faceless figures were gone, the air no longer heavy with their presence. The only sound was the faint crackle of broken equipment sparking in the corner. It was over. Or so I thought. I stumbled out of the studio, my legs shaky, my mind spinning. The hallway was eerily quiet, the faint hum of fluorescent lights the only indication that the station was still intact. "Janice?" I called, my voice hoarse. No answer. I made my way to the producer's booth, my stomach sinking when I saw it was still empty. The monitors were dark, and Janice's headset lay discarded on the desk. She was gone. I stepped outside into the cool night air, the city strangely still. My car was parked where I'd left it, the streets empty under the glow of the streetlights. But something felt wrong. The world was too quiet. The drive home was a blur, my mind replaying everything that had happened. The calls. The voices. The faceless figures. What had I unleashed? And had I really stopped it, or had I just delayed the inevitable? When I reached my apartment, I hesitated before going inside, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The air felt heavy again, like it had in the studio before the figures appeared. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. The living room was dark, but as I reached for the light switch, I froze. There, in the reflection of the window, was a figure. It had no face. The phone rang, piercing the silence. I turned slowly, my blood running cold as I saw the landline on the table. It shouldn't have been working, I hadn't used it in years, but the shrill tone filled the room. Trembling, I picked up the receiver and pressed it to my ear. "Adrian," a voice whispered. It was Eleanor. "You closed the door," she said softly. "Then why are they still here?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "They're not." Her voice wavered. "You are." The line went dead. I dropped the receiver, my mind spinning. I turned back to the window, and the figure was still there, closer now, its faceless head tilted as if studying me. And then, it smiled. Some doors, once opened, can never truly be shut.